Your kids wouldn't last outdoors. My sister-in-law, Ramona, scoffed, her voice carrying across the polished mahogany of the dinner table. They're too used to video games and air conditioning. Ironwood Ridge isn't a playground, Estelle. It's for serious survivalists. She announced she had booked the exclusive reserve for a family trip, pointedly looking at me. I excluded your family to save them the embarrassment. The table erupted in nervous laughter. My husband was away, and my parents simply chuckled, avoiding my eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my children. I just took a slow sip of my wine, thinking about the heavy iron deed sitting in the fireproof safe in my office. The deed that proved I didn't just know ironwood. I owned it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I drove home in silence, the laughter still ringing in my ears like a debt collection call. It wasn't the first time. For years, I had analyzed the data points of my family's dynamic. Their laughter wasn't joy, it was a compliance tax. They paid it to Ramona to avoid her emotional audits. For a decade, I had been the silent investor in their peace, absorbing the insults so they wouldn't have to deal with the explosion. That was the trap of normalized cruelty. You convince yourself you're keeping the peace when really you're just funding the war against your own self-respect. My parents had chosen comfort over protection, sacrificing my children's dignity to keep Ramona's ego inflated. But tonight, the ledger had unbalanced. They didn't know that when the eccentric old survivalist passed, he hadn't left his legacy to the loud niece who treated nature like a backdrop for selfies. He had left it to the quiet, great niece who sat with him for hours learning to read the wind and the moss. Ironwood Ridge wasn't a campground, it was a conservation fortress, a place that demanded competence, not credit cards. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a notification from the Ironwood booking system. Ramona had requested the Platinum Survival Package for next weekend. The cost was $8,400. I pulled into my driveway and stared at the screen, a cold clarity settling over me. The Platinum package wasn't luxury, it was a brutal, unassisted immersion test designed for elite rangers. No electricity, no running water, no mercy. It was an environment that stripped away pretense and left only truth. I could have canceled it. I could have called her and warned her that she was walking into a buzzsaw. Instead, I tapped approve. Inside, I found Gideon and Clementine debugging code on their tablets. They looked up, their eyes bright and intelligent, the kind of intelligence that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Pack your gear," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Real gear. We're going to Ironwood." "Did Aunt Ramona invite us?" Gideon asked, surprised. "No," I replied, heading for the stairs to open my safe. "But the owner did." We arrived at Ironwood Ridge just after noon. The air wasn't just fresh, it was thin, sharp with the scent of pine and impending judgment. My SUV, packed with technical gear and thermal layers, parked silently next to Ramona's pristine white luxury vehicle. Ramona stepped out, looking like a catalog advertisement for hiking rather than an actual hiker. Designer leggings, brand new boots that had never touched mud, and a full face of makeup. She looked around, her smile faltering as the reality of the Platinum package set in. There was no lodge, there were no glamping pods with heated floors, there was no Wi-Fi signal. There was just the imposing, silent wall of the forest. "Where is the staff?" she demanded, spinning around. "Where are the power hookups for the portable heaters?" I leaned against my car, crossing my arms. "It's a wilderness reserve, Ramona. Platinum means minimal interference. It's just us and the land." She scoffed, pulling out her phone. "Ridiculous. I'm going to get some content before we set up. The lighting is good." She marched toward the trailhead marker, arranging her husband and children like props. She posed with hiking poles she didn't know how to use, tilting her head to catch the light, feigning exhaustion she hadn't earned. It was a performance of effort without the labor. Gideon watched her, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward quietly. "Aunt Ramona, you're standing on dicranum moss. It takes decades to establish. You're killing it." The silence that followed was brittle. Ramona froze, her perfect smile dropping into a sneer. She didn't step off the moss. She dug her heel in deeper. "Excuse me," she snapped, her voice high and sharp. "Don't speak to me like that, you little know-it-all. Go play with your iPad and leave the adults alone." I watched her face contort and realized I was witnessing a textbook narcissistic injury. My son's quiet, factual knowledge didn't just annoy her, it threatened her entire existence. Ramona had built a fortress out of perceptions. She needed to be seen as the expert, the adventurer, the golden girl. Gideon, by simply knowing the name of a plant, had exposed the hollowness of her performance. He offered substance where she only had style, and to a person like Ramona, that wasn't a correction, it was an attack. She had to devalue him to re-inflate herself. "Gideon, come here," I said, my voice low. He walked over, confused. "She doesn't care about the moss, honey. She cares about the picture. Remember that." As the afternoon wore on, the reserve began to assert itself. The sun dipped below the ridgeline, and the temperature plummeted. The wind picked up, cutting through their fashionable windbreakers. The golden hour lighting Ramona was obsessed with faded into a blue, biting twilight. The forest wasn't a backdrop anymore. It was a cold, indifferent reality, and Ramona was beginning to realize she couldn't filter it away. "Where is he?" Ramona was pacing, hugging her designer coat around her shivering frame. "I paid for the elite guide. He should have been here an hour ago to set up the heated tents." A figure emerged from the tree line, walking with a steady, practiced gait. It was Gideon. He was wearing the deep green vest of a junior wilderness ranger, patched with insignia that represented hundreds of hours of fieldwork. He carried a heavy canvas roll on his back. Ramona stopped pacing. She looked behind him, scanning the trees. "Where's the guide?" "Gideon, I'm the guide," Gideon said, his voice dropping an octave, imitating the calm authority of his great-uncle. "Welcome to the ridge. Let's get your shelter up before the frost hits." Ramona let out a bark of laughter that sounded like a yelp. "You? You're 12. Is this a joke, Estelle? I paid $8,000 for a professional, not a babysitting gig." "You paid for the best," I said, leaning against a tree, watching the wind whip Ramona's hair across her face. "Gideon is the youngest certified ranger in the state. He knows this terrain better than anyone. I suggest you listen to him." "Absolutely not," Ramona spat. "Forrest, get the tent from the car, the big one. We'll do it ourselves." Forrest, her husband, dragged a massive duffel bag from the trunk. It was a luxury expedition tent, the kind with 4 rooms and color-coded poles that required an engineering degree to assemble. He dumped the contents onto the uneven ground. Poles clattered everywhere, the instructions blew away instantly, tumbling into a ravine. "Just figure it out," Ramona shrieked, grabbing a pole and jamming it into the dirt. 10 yards away, Gideon and Clementine were already moving. They didn't need to. Clementine located a natural depression near a rock face, a windbreak. Gideon began gathering debris, dry leaves, pine boughs, sturdy branches. They worked with a fluid efficiency that was almost hypnotic. Gideon constructed a structural frame using a fallen ridgepole. Clementine packed the insulation, layering the leaves thick enough to trap body heat. They weren't fighting the wind, they were using the landscape to hide from it. At Ramona's campsite, chaos reigned. The luxury tent was a giant kite. Every time Forrest got a wall up, the wind slapped it back down. Ramona was screaming instructions that contradicted physics. "Hold it steady. Why is it flapping? Use more stakes." "The ground is frozen, Ramona," Forrest yelled back, frustration finally cracking his facade. "The stakes won't go in." My parents, huddled in their coats, watched the scene unfold. They looked from the flailing, screaming adults to the 2 children working silently in the twilight. Gideon and Clementine's shelter was finished, a compact, thermally efficient debris hut that looked like part of the forest floor. Clementine crawled out, brushing pine needles from her knees.
"Mom, interior temp is 55 and holding. We're good." Ramona abandoned the tent, marching over to us, her face streaked with mascara and rage. "This is ridiculous. They're cheating. They probably have heaters in there. It's a trick." Gideon looked at her, his expression calm. It's physics, Auntie. Dead airspace is the best insulator. Your tent has too much surface area. The wind load is too high. Stop talking down to me, she screamed, her voice cracking. I want a refund. I want to speak to the manager right now. Wesley isn't a manager, I said softly. He's a warden, and he's on his way. The temperature dropped further as night fell. The cold seeped through even the most expensive parkas. At Ramona's campsite, morale was non-existent. They had no fire, no shelter, and no patience. The only light came from the dying batteries of their phones. Ramona was shivering violently, her face a mask of misery and entitlement. She marched toward the reserve's main cabin, where a single lantern glowed. Wesley stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching her approach. "This is unacceptable," she screamed, her voice cracking in the cold air. "We are freezing. I paid $8,000 for the platinum package, and I demand a refund immediately, compensation for this torture." Wesley didn't blink. "You paid for an unassisted wilderness experience, ma'am. That is what you received." "I don't care," she shrieked. "I want to speak to the owner right now. I'm going to have you fired. I'm going to sue this entire place into the ground." My parents and Forrest stood behind her, looking miserable and embarrassed, but unwilling to intervene. They were still caught in the trap, believing Ramona's noise was power. Wesley slowly removed his hat. He looked past Ramona's shoulder directly at me, standing in the shadows near the fire Gideon had built. "The owner is right there, ma'am." Ramona spun around, confusion warring with her rage. "What? Estelle?" She laughed, a high, incredulous sound. "Estelle doesn't own anything. She's a broke architect." I stepped forward into the circle of firelight. The warmth of the flames danced on the deed, a digital copy on my tablet, illuminated against the darkness. "I own Ironwood Ridge, Ramona," I said, my voice calm, projecting easily over the wind. "Great-uncle Elias left it to me 5 years ago. He knew I was the only one who wouldn't sell it for condos or turn it into a glamping resort." The silence that descended was absolute. The wind howled through the trees, but no one moved. My parents stared at me, their mouths agape. Forrest looked from me to the imposing forest around us, realization dawning in his eyes. You own this?" Ramona stammered, her face draining of color. "But why didn't you say anything? Why did you let me book it?" "Because you didn't ask," I said simply. "You assumed. You assumed my children were incompetent because they're quiet. You assumed I was weak because I don't brag. And you assumed you could buy your way through nature." I scrolled on the tablet, showing the transaction record. "You paid $8,400 for the privilege of being taught a lesson you should have learned years ago. Nature doesn't care who you are, it only cares what you can do." Ramona looked at the tablet, then at the freezing darkness surrounding her, and finally at me. For the first time in her life, she had no comeback. She was cold, she was powerless, and she was standing on my land. The cold was settling deep now, the kind of chill that bypassed coats and settled directly into the bones. Ramona stood there, shrunken by the revelation, waiting for the explosion. She expected me to scream, to evict them, to mirror the cruelty she had shown us for years. But rage is a waste of energy in a survival situation, and this was survival, not just of the body, but of the family itself. "You can stay," I said, my voice cutting through the wind. Ramona blinked, shocked. "But under my rules, and the first rule of Ironwood is simple. You consume what you create. Right now, you're freezing because you haven't earned your warmth." I signaled to Gideon. He didn't need words. He walked over to a dry patch of earth near the tree line and sat down, pulling a small curved piece of wood and a spindle from his pack. "Sit down, Aunt Ramona," he said, patting the ground next to him. It wasn't a request. She looked at the dirt, then at her pristine pants, and finally at me. Seeing no mercy in my eyes, she lowered herself onto the frozen ground. "This is a bow drill," Gideon explained, his voice calm and instructional, devoid of the earlier hurt. "It uses friction to create an ember. It's not about strength, it's about consistency. If you stop, you lose the heat. If you go too fast, you exhaust yourself." He handed her the bow. You try." Ramona took it, her hands trembling. She struggled to keep the spindle upright. It slipped, skittering across the wood. She tried again, frustration mounting. "It's not working." "You're forcing it," Clementine said, stepping in to adjust Ramona's grip. "Let the bow do the work. Breathe." For the next 20 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic scraping of wood on wood and Ramona's ragged breathing. My parents in Forest watched in silence, stripped of their usual distractions. There were no phones, no status symbols, just the raw effort of a woman trying to create a single spark. Finally, a wisp of smoke curled up. "Stop," Gideon commanded gently. "Feed it." He handed her a bundle of dried tinder. "Gently, like you're holding a baby bird." Ramona blew on the ember, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide with focus. When the tinder burst into a small, fragile flame, she gasped. It wasn't the roar of a generator or the click of a lighter. It was something she had made. She looked up at Gideon, really seeing him for the first time, not as a city kid, but as a master of a world she didn't understand. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't thank me," Gideon said, standing up and brushing off his knees. "Feed the fire or it dies." As the warmth began to spread, I watched the dynamic shift. The hierarchy of noise and flash had dissolved. In its place was something quieter, harder, and infinitely more real. Ramona sat by the fire she had sweated for, humbled not by my words, but by her own hands. Morning broke over Ironwood Ridge with a stillness that felt different than the day before. It wasn't the silence of absence, it was the quiet of respect. The sun filtered through the trees, warming the damp earth. I stepped out of my tent to find the campsite transformed. The luxury tent was gone, packed away. Ramona was already awake, moving quietly around the perimeter, picking up trash, not just her own, but old debris left by previous storms. She wasn't wearing her designer boots, she was wearing sneakers, her hair tied back simply, her hands dirty. "Morning," she said, straightening up when she saw me. She looked tired, but for the first time, she looked real. "I'm packing out everything we brought. Leave no trace, right? That's the rule." I nodded, pouring coffee from a thermos into 2 mugs. I handed her one. She took it with both hands, grateful for the warmth. "Estelle, I don't know how to apologize for yesterday, or for the last 5 years." "You don't have to apologize," I said. "You just have to change." "I know." She looked over at the fire pit, now cold and properly doused. "Watching Gideon last night, I realized something. I've been so busy trying to look like I own the world that I forgot how to live in it. I have millions of followers who think I'm an expert, and I couldn't even keep my family warm." "Influence isn't competence," I said gently. "Great Uncle Elias used to say that noise proves nothing. Often a hen who has merely laid an egg cackles as if she laid an asteroid." Ramona laughed, a genuine, self-deprecating sound. "He sounds like he was quite a character." He was, and he left me this land not because I was the loudest, but because I listened. I looked out at the forest, feeling the weight of the legacy shift from a burden to a foundation. Stewardship isn't about power, Ramona. It's about protection. It's about knowing that we are temporary, but the land is forever. My job isn't to keep people out, it's to teach them how to be here. The rest of the family emerged from their tents. There was no rush to leave, no frantic scrolling through phones. My parents were helping Gideon break down the debris hut, asking him about structural integrity. Forrest was listening to Clementine explain how to filter water. The hierarchy had been reset. The city kids were the leaders, and the adults were the students. We packed up in a coordinated rhythm. When we reached the cars, Ramona stopped me. "Estelle," she said, can we come back? Not for content, just to learn properly this time." I looked at her, then at Gideon and Clementine, who were beaming with pride, dirt-streaked and happy.
The reserve is always open to those who respect it, I said. Next time, leave the platinum package at home. Bring your work boots. As we drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Gideon and Clementine were fast asleep in the back seat, exhausted and triumphant. The silence in the car wasn't empty, it was full. It was the silence of a lesson learned, a legacy secured, and a family finally truly waking up. If you believe that competence speaks louder than arrogance, hit that like button and share this story. And tell me in the comments, what's a skill you have that people constantly underestimate? I read every single one.